The winter of 42, Stalingrad, a city that no longer exists. All that remains is a skeleton, ravaged, scorched black, frozen into the ice of the Volga. Among the ruins, which look like the shattered bones of a giant prehistoric beast, a silence reigns. Not the kind of silence you find in peacetime, ringing and full of calm. This is a different kind, a dead, viscous silence, as heavy as a tombstone, a silence in which every rustle, every creak of frozen rebar sounds louder than a gunshot. In the basements, in burrows dug into the frozen earth, the remnants of Paulus's 6th Army lie in hiding. They are no longer soldiers, they are shadows, ghosts, living out their final hours in a frozen hell. They no longer fear the roar of the Katyushas or the thunder of artillery duels. One can get used to that, but there is one sound that makes the blood run cold in the veins of even the most hardened veterans, and then this dead silence begins to tremble. From somewhere across the Volga, out of the gray, indifferent haze, a sound is born. At first, it's barely perceptible, like the cry of a distant lost child, but it quickly grows, gaining strength, turning into something unimaginable. It's not the whistle of a shell or the drone of a bomb. It is a high, vibrating, drawn-out howl, a sound that seems not of this world. It's like a violin played by a madman, a single, endless, soul-cutting note. The German soldiers press themselves into the walls of their shelters. Their faces, overgrown with stubble and coated in frost, contort with superstitious terror. They cover their ears, but the sound penetrates directly into the brain. They call it many things: der Heuler, the Howler, der Schwarze Tod, the Black Death. But one nickname stuck more than any other. It sounded like sinister poetry: Die Schwarze Geige des Todes, the black violin of death. Because after this howl reaches its crescendo, the music stops. There is a split second of absolute silence, and then the earth erupts. A short, furious explosion, and a rain of red-hot shrapnel sides down everything living. That sound was more terrifying than the explosion itself. It was the prelude to inevitable death. It was a funeral mass that an invisible orchestra performed for them every day, and the lead instrument in this orchestra was her, the black violin. This is not just a story about a weapon, it is the story of how a simple piece of steel pipe, created by an engineer's genius, was turned into an instrument of psychological terror. The story of the Soviet mortar. Every revolution begins with a simple, bold idea. The revolution in artillery, which gave the Red Army its black violin, was born in the mind of a man whose name became synonymous with the mortar itself, Boris Ivanovich Shavirin. He was not a theorist but a hands-on practitioner, an engineer who sought not elegance of form, but ultimate function. In the 1930s, as Europe prepared for another great war, military theorists worldwide wrestled with a single problem. How could they give the infantry, the main force of any army, its own powerful and mobile fire support? Cannons were too heavy and cumbersome. Machine guns could only fire in a straight line. What was needed was pocket artillery that a soldier could carry and use right from the trench. It was Shavirin and his design bureau, building on the ideas of the father of mortar science, Nikolai Dorovlev, who perfected this concept with brilliant simplicity. They stripped away everything non-essential, leaving only 3 elements, as pure in their function as an ancient sculpture: a smooth barrel, a bipod, and a base plate. There were no complex bolts, no recoil mechanisms. A mortar shell was simply dropped into the barrel. Its own weight would cause it to strike a firing pin at the bottom, and the propellant gases would launch it into the sky. That was it. This was a weapon born for total war. It could be produced not in specialized artillery plants, but in almost any workshop with a lathe. Schoolboys and housewives, now working the machines, could churn out these simple tubes by the thousands. The Red Army received an entire family of such mortars. The most common was the 82mm battalion mortar, a lightweight, collapsible weapon that a crew of just a few men could carry over any rough terrain. Towering over it was the 120mm regimental mortar, a true beast that, despite weighing just over 200 kilograms, packed the firepower of a full-fledged howitzer. Combat experience at Kalkengol, and especially in the brutal Winter War with Finland, proved this weapon to be indispensable. In forests, in mountains, in urban combat, wherever conventional artillery was powerless, the mortar became the god of war. By the summer of 1942, thanks to Chavirin's genius, the Red Army had not only caught up with, but had begun to surpass the Wehrmacht in its number of mortars. Thousands of these simple, rugged, and deadly tubes were ready to play their sinister melody across every front, from the Barents to the Black Sea. To understand the sheer terror a German soldier felt at the word mortar, you have to forget about conventional artillery. A cannon or a howitzer is a weapon of a direct, almost honest duel. Its shell flies on a low, predictable trajectory. You can take cover from it behind a hill, a thick wall, or in a deep trench. It is terrifying, but its logic is understandable. The mortar, however, is a weapon from another world. Its greatest advantage, its diabolical essence, lies in its high arc trajectory. Imagine this: a shell leaving the barrel doesn't race toward its target. It soars almost vertically into the sky, reaching a great height, and for a moment it hangs motionless at the apex of its parabola. Then, pulled down only by the force of gravity, it begins to fall, and it falls almost straight down, like a bird of prey with folded wings. For the soldier on the ground, this meant one thing: there was no escape. Everything that once offered a sense of security now became a death trap. A deep trench? The shell would fall right to the bottom, wiping out everyone huddled inside. A building's wall? It would fly right over it and explode in the courtyard or on the roof. The reverse slope of a hill, normally the safest place from direct fire, to the mortar, it was a perfect exposed target. A dense forest? A cannon shell would get tangled in the trees, but a mortar shell would slip through the canopy and detonate just above the ground. On the front lines, this phenomenon earned a grim but fitting nickname: dead water. It comes from an old fairy tale where dead water first reassembles a dismembered body before living water brings it back to life. A mortar barrage was that dead water, covering a specific grid on the map and annihilating all life within it. There was no muzzle flash, no sight of the gun itself, only an ominous howl from the heavens, and death arriving from directly above. This shattered a soldier's psyche. He no longer felt safe anywhere. Any cover felt like an illusion. This wasn't a battle. It was extermination from above, carried out by an invisible enemy. The mortar turned the battlefield into a three-dimensional space where death could come not just from the front or the side, but from the sky, from a point directly over your head. This realization was paralyzing. It created a primal, irrational fear that could break even the most hardened Prussian discipline. The human ear is a remarkably sensitive and fickle instrument. It can distinguish millions of shades of sound, but most importantly, it is inextricably linked to our center of fear. Sometimes, the sound itself is far more terrifying than its source. An explosion is a physical impact, instantaneous pain and destruction, but the sound that precedes it is the torture of anticipation, a form of psychological violence stretched out over time. And in this sinister symphony of war, the Soviet mortar was the soloist, playing its part on the most terrible of all stringed instruments. Why the violin? This nickname given by the enemy was not born from nothing. It is the result of a complex combination of acoustics, aerodynamics, and a deep cultural code. In European culture, the violin has always carried a dual, almost mystical meaning. On one hand, it is a divine instrument, capable of bringing tears of joy. On the other, it is an attribute of the devil himself. The legends of Paganini, who sold his soul for his virtuoso playing, or Tartini's Devil's Trill, composed after the devil appeared to him in a dream and played the violin. All this created an aura around the instrument of something otherworldly, inhuman. A violin playing out of tune, dissonantly, on a single ear-splitting note is an archetypal image of encroaching madness and death, and the sound of a flying mortar shell strikingly coincided with this deep, subconscious fear. First, there was the frequency of the sound. It wasn't low, like the drone of a bomber, nor was it sharp, like the whistle of a bullet. It was a high, piercing sound that fell into the very range the human ear perceives as most alarming. It is a sound similar to a scream, a cry, or the screech of metal on glass. It is physically unpleasant. It makes you instinctively flinch. Second, there were the dynamics of the sound. It was not monotonous. It began somewhere high above, barely audible, and then began to grow slowly but relentlessly. This was the perfect acoustic embodiment of inevitability. A soldier in a trench could hear his own death approaching and could do nothing. This crescendo effect, the gradual increase in volume, pushed nervous tension to its breaking point. Men went mad not from the explosions, but from this agonizing, drawn-out howl that seemed to last an eternity. Third, there was the timbre of the sound. Due to the shell's aerodynamics, its rotation, and the vibration of its stabilizing fins, the sound was not clean. It was rattling, vibrating, with many extraneous overtones. It didn't just fly, it trembled like an over-tightened string. This is what created the analogy with a violin, not a perfectly tuned Stradivarius, but the dried-out old fiddle of a village madman, sawing his bow across the same string, tearing the very soul from it. These three factors, the high, unpleasant frequency, the crescendo effect, and the rattling timbre, combined to create that unique acoustic signature. The Germans, with their rich musical culture, could not fail to grasp this terrible analogy. The Black Violin of Death is not just a nickname. It is a precise, poetic, and complete description of the psychological effect produced by the Soviet mortar. It didn't just kill. It first drove its victims mad with its music. It played a requiem for those who were still alive, but already doomed, and therein lay its ultimate unbearable cruelty. When the eerie howl of the black violin ceased, there was a split second of deafening absolute silence. It was the most terrifying silence in the world because it meant the musical prelude was over and the bloody finale was about to begin. Then came a short, vicious, ragged explosion, and hell was unleashed on Earth. To understand the nature of this hell, we must again look at the design. A mortar mine is not an artillery shell. A shell is a thick-walled steel slug designed to pierce armor or destroy fortifications. Its explosive power is great, but its fragmentation effect is relatively small. A mine, however, was created with a single purpose: to kill personnel. It is, in essence, a thin-walled container of cast iron filled to the brim with explosives. The designers specifically chose a grade of cast iron that, upon detonation, didn't just break into pieces, but shattered into a huge number of small, sharp-edged fragments. A standard 82mm mine produced from 400 to 600 fragments. Its big sister, the 120mm mine weighing almost 16 kilograms, would turn into a cloud of 1,000 or more red-hot, jagged pieces of metal. These fragments did not fly in a straight line. The explosion of a mine that had fallen almost vertically created a kind of umbrella of death. The fragments fanned out at a low angle to the ground, striking everything within a radius of dozens of meters. It was as if a giant anti-personnel grenade had fallen from the sky. For the infantry caught in such a barrage, it was pure hell. The sheer density of fire was overwhelming. A few mortars firing rapidly could cover an entire football field with a solid carpet of steel in just 1 minute. Not a single square meter remained safe. a soldier rarely received just one wound. More often, their body would be riddled with dozens of small, hot fragments. These didn't always kill instantly, but they inflicted terrible, agonizing injuries, causing shock and massive bleeding. Field hospitals were flooded with soldiers suffering from such fragmentation wounds, and saving them was incredibly difficult. The psychological effect was devastating. A person's instinct is to drop to the ground for cover, but against mortar fire, this was useless. The shrapnel flew low to the ground, finding its victims even in the slightest depression. This created a feeling of absolute helplessness. German soldiers, accustomed to order and clear tactics, were thrown into chaos. Their well-drilled battle formations disintegrated. Under mortar fire, it was impossible to advance and impossible to defend. The only option was to lie flat, press into the earth, and pray that the next mine wouldn't land in your trench. The mortar was the ideal weapon of terror. It didn't destroy tanks or pillboxes. It exterminated people. Systematically, ruthlessly, methodically. It turned the battlefield into a meat grinder, chewing up infantry and breaking its fighting spirit. After the black violin had played its part, a silence fell, broken only by the groans of the wounded. The shrapnel hell was over, leaving behind only mangled bodies and paralyzing fear. Fear of the unseen is one of the most powerful forces. It is one thing to see an enemy tank or a machine gun nest and try to destroy it. It is quite another when death arrives from the void, its source as elusive as a ghost. Soviet mortar crews, whether consciously or intuitively, perfected this effect, giving birth to a tactic that turned their weapon from merely deadly into something truly diabolical. This tactic was called the roving mortar. Its essence was brilliant in its simplicity and perfectly suited for this particular weapon. The mortar, especially the 82mm model, was light and mobile. It could be disassembled into three parts: the barrel, bipod, and base plate, and carried by the crew. And while the 120mm version was heavier, it could still be easily towed by a simple horse or a light truck. This mobility became the key to their ghostly warfare. The operational algorithm of a roving battery was simple and deadly. Preparation. Several 4 to 5 concealed firing positions were prepared in advance. These could be ravines, thick bushes, the ruins of a house, or forest clearings. Barrage. The mortar crew would stealthily move to the first position. They would conduct a short but very intense barrage. 5 to 10 shells fired in a matter of minutes at a pre-scouted target. An infantry concentration, a headquarters, or a field kitchen. Disappearance. Immediately after the last shot, without waiting for return fire, the crew would instantly pack up the mortar and just as stealthily move to the next reserve position, located hundreds of meters or even a kilometer away. Repetition. After some time, as the enemy began to recover, the attack would be repeated, but from a new location. For the German soldier in his trench, this was a surreal nightmare. First, the black violin would begin its funeral mass from somewhere to the right. Retaliatory artillery fire would rain down on that spot, churning up the earth. But there was no one there. Then, 10 minutes later, the sinister howl would come from the left, and then from the rear. This created the false and terrifying impression among the enemy that they were surrounded, that they were being methodically shelled by a huge number of artillery pieces from all directions. Morale would crumble, panic would set in. Nerves couldn't stand this cat and mouse game with death where you are the mouse, and death is an invisible cat, striking with its clawed paw from around every corner. Counter-battery fire, a source of German pride, was rendered powerless. It was possible to locate a mortar's position by its sound or flash. But by the time German artillerymen had calculated the coordinates and aimed their guns, only the wind was blowing where the Soviet mortar crew had been. They struck and vanished like ghosts, leaving behind only corpses and the maddening fear of the next attack from nowhere. The roving battery tactic transformed a simple weapon into an intelligent, cunning, and elusive evil that was nearly impossible to fight. If the sound of the 82mm mine was like the piercing screech of an out-of-tune violin, the voice of the 120mm regimental mortar PM38 was deeper, more guttural, and therefore even more sinister. It resembled the roar of a cello from the underworld, the very one that plays the lead part in the orchestra of the apocalypse. This weapon was not just a scaled-up version of its little brother. It was an entirely new level of terror, one that became a true curse for the German infantry. It is no wonder the Germans themselves, after copying it, named their creation the Granatwerfer 42, a sign of the highest praise. So, what was the secret to its magic, its devastating power? First, it offered the perfect balance between power and mobility. Weighing around 280 kilograms in its combat-ready state, it certainly wasn't portable by hand, yet it remained incredibly mobile for its caliber. A special wheeled carriage allowed it to be towed by a light jeep or even a pair of horses, and its crew of 6 could roll it into position by hand on the battlefield. At the same time, its high-explosive fragmentation mine weighed almost 16 kilograms, nearly as much as a shell from a full-size 122mm howitzer. The result was a unique hybrid, the maneuverability of a mortar with the firepower of heavy artillery. Second, there was its range and accuracy. The PM38 could hurl its deadly payload a distance of almost 6 kilometers. This allowed mortar batteries to position themselves far behind the front lines, completely safe from small arms fire, and methodically pound German positions square by square. Its high-angle trajectory, like its smaller counterpart, enabled it to strike targets anywhere, in ravines, forests, or on the reverse slopes of hills. Third, there was its destructive capability. While the 82mm mine mowed down personnel, the 120mm did far more. Its powerful high-explosive charge was capable of destroying light field fortifications, such as bunkers with 3 layers of logs, machine gun nests, and wire entanglements, disabling light armored vehicles. A near miss could damage the running gear, optics, or engine of an armored personnel carrier, while a direct hit would reduce it to a pile of smoking metal, creating paths through minefields. The shockwave from the explosion could detonate anti-personnel mines within a radius of several meters, clearing a path for friendly infantry. The 120mm mortar became a true silver bullet for the Soviet command. It accomplished tasks that were beyond the capability of battalion mortars, all while operating in areas where it was impossible to bring in heavy divisional artillery. As early as 1943, the number of these queens of the battlefield in rifle divisions was increased, and by the end of the war, they accounted for more than half of all the Red Army's artillery pieces. As one German officer wrote after the war, in both defense and offense, the Russians achieved great success with their mortars. East Prussia, for example, was captured by the Russians with the help of mortars, and the main force in this mortar terror was this very weapon, the older sister of the black violin, the 120mm queen of the battlefield. The Wehrmacht, intoxicated by the success of the Blitzkrieg, found itself facing an enemy that didn't play by the rules. The Black Death did not fit into their doctrine of mobile warfare. It was a weapon from another world, more primitive and, for that reason, more terrifying. The German war machine, with its characteristic methodical approach, began to search for a solution. The fight was waged on 3 levels: technological, tactical, and engineering. The technological response. The first and most obvious reaction was to copy the weapon. After studying captured Soviet models, German engineers acknowledged the genius of their simplicity. This led to the creation of their own counterparts. The primary German mortar became the 8cm Granatwerfer 34. It was a solid, high-quality weapon, but also more complex and expensive to produce. When faced with the horrifying power of the 120mm Soviet mortar, the Germans paid the highest form of military compliment. They almost completely copied it, creating their own 12cm Granatwerfer 42. However, here they fell into their own trap. German industry was geared toward producing complex, high-tech weaponry. They simply could not produce mortars in the same quantities as the Soviet Union, where they were churned out in almost any factory. The German mortar was good, but there were always fewer of them than their Soviet counterparts. The tactical response. The main objective became counter-battery fire, the attempt to destroy Soviet mortars before they could strike. Special units for sound and flash intelligence were used for this purpose. Sound-ranging Schallmessung, sensitive microphones placed on the front lines would pick up the sound of a mortar firing. A calculating device, complex for its time, could then determine the coordinates of the firing battery with some accuracy based on the time difference of the sound's arrival at different microphones. Flash spotting, Lichtmessung. At night, observers would spot the muzzle flash of the shot. Using data from several posts, they could also determine the mortar's location through triangulation. Once a position was identified, the coordinates were relayed to their own artillery, which was supposed to immediately blanket the area with fire. In theory, it was a flawless system. In practice, it was a ghost hunt. The Soviet tactic of roving mortars rendered all these clever tricks useless. By the time the German sound rangers took their measurements and the artillery men entered the corrections to aim their howitzers, the Soviet crew had already packed up their equipment and was sprinting to a backup position. The German counterattack most often struck an empty piece of ground. The engineering response. When it became clear that destroying the mortars was impossible, the Germans tried to hide from them. A veritable fortification fever began. Standard trenches were covered with layers of logs and earth. Special bunkers with reinforced roofs appeared. In defensive positions, the Germans even built small concrete shelters, Splitterschutzzelle, designed for 1 or 2 soldiers to protect them from shrapnel. But this too was only a partial solution. It was impossible to cover all the trenches and communication lines. It was impossible to build a bunker for every soldier. During an advance or on the march, the infantry was completely defenseless. These fortifications created only an illusion of safety, an illusion that shattered with the first howl of the black violin. In the end, the Germans lost this duel in the dark. They tried to counter a crude, asymmetrical, and cunning tactic with their own complex, symmetrical, and costly system. They were fighting the weapon, but they needed to fight the tactic. But the Soviet mortar and its deployment tactic were a single entity, a simple, cheap, and incredibly effective organism that devoured their infantry faster than they could find answers. When people talk about the artillery of the Great Patriotic War, one primary image immediately comes to mind: the fiery whirlwind of the rocket launchers, the legendary BM-13, the Katyusha, its howl, its fiery trails in the night sky, and its ability to turn acres of land into a scorched desert in seconds. All of this made it the absolute and undisputed symbol of Soviet military might. The Katyusha was a weapon of shock, demoralization, and total annihilation. It was the soloist whose appearance on stage was always met with applause from its own side, and panicked terror from the enemy. But behind the scenes of this grand theater of war, in the shadow of the bright spotlights aimed at the Katyusha, stood another hero, a humble, inconspicuous, grimy workhorse, without whom no operation, no battle could have been fought. A hero whose work was less spectacular, but far more important and bloody. This unjustly forgotten hero was the mortar. If we use the analogy of an orchestra, the Katyusha was the percussion section, powerful, loud, joining in at the most climactic moments to stun and overwhelm. The mortars, however, were the string section, vast, ever-present, playing their part from the first note of the symphony to the last. Their music may not have been as deafening, but it was what created the very fabric of the battle, its tension, and its tragedy. Let's compare them on some key parameters. Accuracy. The Katyusha was an area denial weapon. It fired over areas, covering huge territories with very low precision. The mortar, however, in the hands of an experienced crew, was almost a sniper's weapon. It could drop a shell into a specific trench, behind a particular house, or onto a single machine gun crew. Flexibility and availability. A Katyusha salvo was a major event, requiring preparation and the transport of a large number of rockets. A Katyusha battery was a reinforcement asset at the army or front level. The mortar, on the other hand, was the infantry's own weapon. It was always on hand, in the battalion, in the regiment. It could respond immediately to any request from an infantry commander, suppressing a firing position or repelling a counterattack. It was the last-mile artillery. The economics of war. The rocket shell was complex and expensive to produce. A standard mortar shell was extremely cheap. This allowed them to be produced in colossal quantities and used without hesitation in battle. Soviet industry produced hundreds of millions of mortar shells during the war, a figure unthinkable for any other type of ammunition. Contribution to enemy losses. As terrifying as the psychological effect of the Katyusha was, the vast majority of casualties suffered by the German infantry were not caused by it. According to historians, mortar fire was responsible for more than half of all personnel losses on the Eastern Front. It was the primary butcher of the war, the main exterminator of infantry. The Katyusha scorched the earth, the mortar mowed down men. The Katyusha was a weapon of breakthrough and intimidation. The mortar was the weapon of daily, routine, dirty trench warfare. The Katyusha became a legend, celebrated in songs. The mortar became a silent terror, which its enemies remembered with a shudder, and its own side with respect and gratitude. And herein lies the greatest historical injustice. The humble black violin, which played the primary funeral mass for hundreds of thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers, has remained in the shadow of its louder, more spectacular sister. But without its quiet, daily, and deadly work, victory would have been impossible. The war thundered to a close. The weapons, once symbols of terror and death, were covered and sent to warehouses. On the fields where the sinister music of the black violin had recently played, rye began to grow. It seemed the story of this simple and brutal instrument should have ended along with the terrible era that created it. But ideas that are genius in their simplicity do not die. The mortar created by Boris Shavirin did not become a museum piece. It proved to be so successful, so perfect in its primitive effectiveness, that it became an immortal classic of weapon design. Its design formed the basis for the vast majority of mortar systems in the world. Materials changed, sights were improved, and new types of ammunition appeared, but the principle itself, barrel, baseplate, bipod, remained unshakable. The Soviet mortar became what the Kalashnikov rifle became for small arms, a benchmark, a point of reference, a model to be imitated and copied. And the sinister music of the black violin did not fall silent in May of 1945. It merely changed its geography. Its echoes were heard in the mountains of Korea and the jungles of Vietnam, where Soviet and Chinese copies of the mortar became a nightmare for American infantry. Its sharp, suffocating chords sounded on the scorching sands of the Middle East during the Arab-Israeli wars. Its deadly part was performed in the ravines of Afghanistan, where the light and mobile mortar was the ideal weapon for guerrilla warfare. Even today, in the 21st century, in an era of precision weapons, drones, and smart missiles, the descendant of the black violin, the 120mm mortar, remains one of the most sought-after and effective means of fire support. It is still simple, cheap, and deadly, it is still the infantry's pocket artillery, capable of reaching the enemy where others are powerless. Its ancestor, the PM-38, can still be found in warehouses and even in local conflicts around the world. Thus, a simple weapon, born for one most terrible war, outlived its era and its creators. It became an eternal reminder that in war, it is not always the most complex and expensive that wins. Often, it is the simplest, most reliable, and most ruthless. The black violin of death is not just a terrifying metaphor from the Second World War. It has become a common name for an entire class of weapons whose sinister music, unfortunately, continues to sound on battlefields across the globe, and it seems it has no intention of falling silent. Thank you for watching to the end. If you liked it, please give it a like, subscribe, and don't forget to hit the bell so you don't miss new videos. There are more amazing stories to come. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones.